Hey everybody, and welcome back here for week 10, as we are in the middle of this little mini section here in Paul's letter of chapters 9, 10, and 11. Last week you guys went through chapter 9 and kind of launch into this, where there's this great climax in chapter 8, and then a shift of tone in chapter 9, where Paul really begins to, what I would say, lament. He begins to lament the status of his Jewish brothers and sisters, people who were the chosen nation of God, who still are the chosen nation of God, and what it means that they are not responding to the gospel of Jesus Christ, who comes from that God, who is that God. And so he begins to really start to wrestle this out. And last week we went through a big theological topic of predestination of election and what that means, and so many people line up in different areas on that spectrum. And now here in chapter 10, I want to take some time to give a little bit of a history lesson as to why this section in Romans is occurring, and really what is being highlighted here. The biggest thing that I would say that's being highlighted, and there's probably a lot more, but the flag that I'll wave today is the sovereignty of God. And how important that is, and how important it is to Paul as he begins to wrestle with the Jewish nation, the condition that they are in. And how he hammers home time and time and again that it's really God. It's God who chooses, and we're not to ask why or how. It's understand that he's the one that chooses, and that he is the one that also can use us for methods and for the means of righteousness, and he can use our disobedience as well to bring about his righteousness and the awareness of his message, and that is all at his hands. That he is the one that is working all of this to the end of not only our redemption, but most importantly, so that the world would know who he is, so that he would be glorified. And so that is really what is kind of like this overarching thing that is happening here, because as he begins to look at his Jewish brothers and sisters, not only does he lament their condition, but also gets frustrated with maybe even their hubris in thinking that they are still absolutely 100% right, because they know the law and they know what God is going to do and they know their history. And Paul is saying, that's great that you got all that knowledge, but it doesn't mean anything. It hasn't shown up in the way that he now has understood what it means to be transformed by the Holy Spirit and the gospel message, the saving message of Jesus Christ. And so that's where we're at here as we kind of get into chapter 10. We heard today, this is Sunday that I'm filming this, we heard today Jerry preach on chapter 10, and really kind of flipping the other side of the coin to be like, yes, the Lord does choose, but he chooses us and uses us, and we have a responsibility, and we should have a desire and longing to preach the good news, to go and get our feet dirty and bring the good news to people who need to hear it. But also what's happening in chapter 10 is Paul's wrestle as he goes through what's going on with his Jewish brothers and sisters. And so we get a bit of a history lesson, because here in 9, 10, and 11, he brings about a lot of Old Testament stuff, a lot of prophecies, a lot of Psalms that he uses to speak directly to the Jewish nation, while also teaching to the Gentiles as to whom this letter was written to. So while the Jews are upset that Paul abandoned his heritage, you see, his Jewish kinsmen are probably looking at him as a traitor. That he has abandoned their ways, has abandoned maybe even the covenant of God, which in their minds would have been the sign of circumcision. That he would be preaching to the Gentiles and allowing them into the covenant of God without having that circumcision, without having the standard to follow the law as they understood it. And so they probably look at Paul as a traitor, as someone who has abandoned that. But as Paul does in chapter 10, he throws it right on back. He takes their history that they are thinking that they know and shows them they don't know. They have missed it. Because within their very prophecies, within their very text, within their very history, they should have a knowledge of what it meant for them to be obstinate, to be disobedient to God, what God did in the midst of their disobedience, and prophecies that say that God will use their disobedience to bring in foreign nations. And that is exactly what is happening right now in Paul's time. The foreign nations are coming in, and we are witnessing that this is happening in spite of Israel's disobedience. And so at the end of chapter 10, we get a verse that really kind of hammers home this section of what is the root problem, the cause of concern here for the Israel nation, but also maybe even for us. We can take a lesson from this as well. The end of chapter 10, Paul cites a prophecy and says, "All the day long, I, the Lord, have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people." And that image of stretching out his hands is a sign of friendship, of loyalty, of care and concern. And it's saying here that this happens all the day long in spite of those people's disobedience and those people's rejection of who he is. That is a sign of God's never-ending, all-encompassing mercy and grace, that he continues to stretch out a hand in spite of his people's disobedience. And so what we get from that, and I think what Paul is trying to say, is that the issue isn't God. The issue of the Jewish people not getting the message of Christ isn't that the Lord isn't faithful. It isn't his message that it's faulty in some way, that Paul has gotten it wrong. And it isn't the inclusion of Gentiles. It's not even the Jewish knowledge of the law and right. None of that matters. What the issue is here, why the Jews have rejected the gospel of Christ, is because of their disobedient heart. And what, if anything, what chapter 10 does is that it highlights the effects of a disobedient heart and how that leads to hardness and disbelief and ultimately rejection of the truth in Jesus Christ. And Paul is laying out their history to say, my brothers, Jewish brothers, we have a history of this. We have a history of being disobedient. We have a history of God casting us away and saving a remnant, which we'll talk about in chapter 11. There is a history of this, and there are prophecies that say that God will use these times and ultimately put a stumbling block in the midst of us to say that you are going to reject this, so that the inclusion of the rest of the chosen people of God, the Gentiles, these foreign nations, will be brought in. And hopefully what will happen is that because of this, there will spur a feeling of jealousy in the midst of God's chosen people, that they will see that the foreigners are hearing it, receiving it, and being forever changed, that they too will come and seek out the truth in that message and be folded back in and be renewed and redeemed as God's chosen. So there's a lot. Oh my gosh, there's a lot in 9, 10, and 11. And I kind of bled a little bit into chapter 11, but that's okay. But there's so much going on. Things that you can take away from this is first and foremost the sovereignty of God, that God is working in the midst and is above all of this and is orchestrating all of these things. And how great it is that he includes us in as tools of righteousness, as instruments of righteousness to bring about the good news of Jesus to people who need to hear it. And the other thing is the effects of a disobedient heart and how dangerous that is, and how that leads people down to the path of complete disbelief, and that we know is a grave issue. But stick with it in chapters 9, 10, and 11. This is just a little mini section here, but it's a fascinating section filled with rich history and theology. And so I hope you all are enjoying it. I hope it's challenging you and making you think about things in different ways. But I'm so glad that you all are doing this. And if you have any questions, once again, see Jerry. Have a great time.